am Michael Osborne. I am the Director of Accessible Me Limited. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining already. We've had, I think, something like 125 registrations. So it'll be interesting to see how many join today. I have had a few people who say they can't make it. So hello if you're watching on the recording. So about me, at Accessible Me, we help organisations remove accessibility barriers in learning, training and in digital spaces. We do that by conducting audits and providing tailored support, and we deliver expert training on the topic as well. We've done this with organisations like Virgin Money, British Airways, and we work with them to create a more inclusive learning and working environments. Today's session, as you hopefully should be aware by joining via Eventbrite, is a Q&A all around neurodiversity and workplace in education. I myself am a neurodivergent cocktail of ADHD, autism, Tourette and a number of other invisible conditions. So along the way we will explore some of the common barriers and practical adjustments, and as well as the impact on work and culture. Some checkboxes, and our goal is to empower all of the organisations joining today to build truly inclusive environments that support neurodivergent individuals in meaningful ways. Before we dive in, I do want to highlight that as over the course of today, we are offering a free mini accessibility audit. This will help you identify quick wins to help improve the accessibility in organisation. And to get yours, or to book a call within the session, just drop audit in the chat and we will do our follow-up. And with that, if I can introduce today's guest, Lucinda, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself and let everyone know about you and where you're joining from?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, first of all, thank you everyone so much for joining. I think this is such a critical topic, so it's fantastic to see how much interest there is with everyone wanting to learn about it. So I'm Lucinda Hensley. I'm a Learning Solutions Manager at a company called Calidus. So we work with lots of different organisations. Interventions to create a positive organisational impact for them, and my role is very much in kind of helping do the upfront analysis and recommend the creative treatments backed by a fantastic production team that kind of then help us bring those experiences to life. I myself was diagnosed with ADHD about 2 years ago over what was quite a hard slog, not the easiest sort of diagnoses to get nowadays. And I was also diagnosed with dyslexia when I was younger as well. So I kind of knew some of the neurodiversity challenges that I was facing as I went through school and education, but it's only in the most recent couple of years that I kind of had the full picture of how my brain works. So it's been a really interesting journey for me, kind of learning about myself, and that kind of inspiring me to learn about the wider spectrum of neurodiversity and what that means for people in the workplace and in learning.
Fantastic, and thank you for making that introduction. For anyone still joining us, please do take the opportunity where you're joining from today, so feel free to pop your name in the chat and where you can. Verity, thank you for commenting in the chat. We can absolutely do that. What I'm going to do is, I did promise you a interactive session today, so I'm going to share my screen. Please do give us a thumbs up that you can see it. Hopefully you can shortly.
I can see that, yeah.
You can, yes. Okay, so today we're going to be using a tool called Klaxoon. Please do join if you are able to do so. This is and what we're going to do is a bit of a interactive whiteboard exercise. So like you would have a virtual whiteboard and you can apply some stickies. I've already populated the board with the questions that you've already entered through Klaxoon. So thank you very much for doing that. And if I now close this, I'm hoping I'm not going to. There we go. So,
okay, Mike, before we go in, there's a request in the chat if it's possible to post the link directly into the chat.
I
right.
absolutely can, yes. I'm just moving the Zoom whiteboard out of the way. So there we go, share and copy link. I have lost the chat, bear with me. chat. There we go. Everyone meeting. There we go. So if you go to the chat now, you should hopefully get the link to get you onto this board. I'll give you a few moments to do that. But in terms of questions from you, over the course of the session, what we've done in advance is ask you the following questions. What would you like to learn or discuss during today's sessions? Do you have any specific questions for us, the panellists? Which of the following areas are you most interested in? And it looks like I've got that twice, so ignore the one on the right. One of the things that have come up a number of times is you want to understand the link between neurodivergence, workplace stress and burnout. You want to understand the importance of flexible work environments and how to regulate some of those, work with some of those strategies. How neurodiversity intersects with mental health, with well-being and also physical health. And also just understanding what neurodiversity is to start with. So I think let's start by defining, okay, what is neurodiversity in the workplace? You know, what kind of things does that cover? And if you do want to ask the questions at any time, if you click plus on the board, you should be able to pop in your idea. If you want to colour code it, feel free to do so, but there's no obligations there. And also, feel free to answer some of these questions. When I was connecting with people on LinkedIn, I've seen a number of you joining today might be SEN teachers, you might work in accessibility, or you might have an interest in accessibility as well. So if you feel able to answer any of these questions yourself, feel free to pop a sticky on the board and do your best to answer. Another thing I'll show you just briefly is if you click on any of these stickies to bring them up, one of the things you can do is hit the little heart there. That's then we'll use this platform to as a way of discovering what it is you want to cover today first and foremost. So let's begin with understanding neurodiversity. So what is neurodiversity and how does that differ from neurodivergence? So those know neurodiversity covers a wide spectrum of different conditions. It covers things like dyslexia and dyscalculia, and all of these neurological conditions affect how you interact with day-to-day life. So, for example, reading a book or reading something on a digital screen. And in terms of how neurodiversity differs from neurodivergent, we are all neurodiverse in some more specific neurodivergent referring to those individuals higher having one of these different conditions. Lucinda, is there anything you'd like to add to that one?
Yeah, I think one of the definitions I've seen for people is that a neurodivergence is pretty much the term for if your brain processes information differently. It's not suggesting that there's one. It's just saying that compared to the kind of the typical, your brain does it ever so slightly differently. And I think it's a really nice way of putting it, talking about the processing of information, then kind of explains why people who are neurodiverse will behave differently in different situations, because it's just how they're taking that stimuli on board. And I think that's a really helpful helping position it for why we're starting to look at, why are there different challenges and strengths there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of framing every neuro. It's helpful not to think that we have a advantage or disadvantage, but that we bring something different to the table. So just to kind of get people thinking, how many of you have worked or managed a neurodivergent colleague? You might have a neurodivergent. And what was your biggest learning experience from that? You can either comment in the chat and let us know. You can grab a sticky and add it to the board. And by the way, I will send snapshots of the board register, whether you have joined the session or not today. Yeah, just thinking about either your experience in the workplace. How has that been? And I think with that, start. Let's move on to a few questions in this space. So how can workplaces move beyond reactive accommodations and create proactive support? Are there specific workplaces adjustments that are effective? And what common accommodations have been overlooked? If you do have further questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But to begin with my experiences, as a teenager, I been on my way back from school one day when all of a sudden my arm shot to the right, and I was thinking, well, that's a bit weird. Little did I know that was going to be the beginning of my tics, part of my Tourette syndrome. For the first year or so, it was mostly motor tics. About a year later, it kind of merged into vocal tics, and about a year after that, is kind of a blend now. 18 years now. I'm very used to it, and I've got a lot of coping techniques. But I remember thinking, doing my work experience actually, my GCSE work experience, and a games company, and there is a individual I could hear very clearly outside, because the games company was a studio above a freezer. He was a forklift operator. And that was one of my first experiences of someone else with Tourette's in the workplace. And I always kind of grew up thinking that when I enter the workplace, I'm probably going to get a back of house job, not a front of house job, not dealing with customers directly. So it was a real positive experience for me when I joined Profitability, the first company I joined post university. When 2 weeks into the job, I was at a client meeting, showing what it is we were working on. So I think one of my favorites is people just as anyone else, and but I was also empowered in how I wanted to approach the topic if it was indeed to come up. So, for example, did I want to tell them in advance I had Tourette's, or if I had a tic, did I want to cover it then? And fortunately for me, I opted to cover it in advance, because having demonstrated or having brought up the product we were there to show them, the managing director at the time who was with me said, okay, so this is the live version that we are showing you today, only for my ticks to very quickly shut him down and say, no, it's not, because I had broken the code base, broken the live version the day before, and made the whole thing tip over. Another thing as well is that's certainly benefited me is the power or quality of a good manager. I've been fortunate and blessed a number of good managers, and certainly from my ADHD perspective, I can get periods of hyper focus. So if I'm enjoying a task, I can get really ingrained, and also if I am distracted or I'm struggling with a task, I can kind of just struggle to get back onto task. So things like I do like to help people, and things like joining sessions. So if people were on Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever, hi Mike, have you got a minute to help me? I'd often drop things to help them, but that would mean that I'm not doing what I should be doing. I found it very difficult to say no, and to get back on task was sometimes a challenge. Now, if I recall in my previous job, my manager saying, hi Mike, I need you to drop what you're doing because an urgent request has come in. Could you quickly do that? And my stop that to go ahead and stop the task, but I am a completer finisher. I couldn't leave that task unfinished, and so even though I knew I should stop and start the next task, I spent some more time finishing what I was doing before moving on to the next one. That did mean I had less time to deliver what was asked of me, and a simple accommodation was then put into place, and that was, if you wanted any of my time, all you had to do was go to my manager, and my manager would help field my tasks to the day. So that kind of time management and working with my diary is something certainly that helped me. But I'm just one individual, and I think what's really, really important is to remember, just because you've met someone with autism, just because you've met someone with ADHD, we are not representative of everyone with these conditions. As a spectrum and more of one of those kind of spider diagrams. You could be high in some areas and low in others, and I think there's a stigma of that if you are neurodiverse, that you're going to be a introvert. You don't want to have these conversations, whereas there are some people with these conditions who absolutely can hold a conversation, who do love to talk, or who do love to fill a noise, and with that in mind, sorry, I'm not saying Lucinda fills the noise by any means, but what I was going to do is just echo that my experiences don't reflect anyone's. So I thought I'd pass over to Lucinda now, just to hear about you and kind of what barriers certainly you've experienced, and if there are indeed any workplace barriers or inclusive practices that you find particularly helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, the main thing, particularly looking at inclusive practices, is recognizing that we don't want everyone to fit into like right. If you think of it more as like a squiggly thing where people can push one barrier in one direction, pull another barrier in another direction, it's a great way to think about the fact that we need to figure out what we need individuals to do in the workplace, and then almost giving them as much freedom as you can to allow them to figure out the best way that works for them. So, for example, for me, if I'm working on something that's almost like a long-term initiative, I will really struggle because there is no pressure for me to get started. I need to have something kind of time-bound, some form of pressure that will motivate me to do it. Then I'll do it really quickly. I'm a very fast worker, but I need that motivation to push me into it. So some of the things I've done with my manager is when we have our weekly one-to-ones, we've got like a structured form that I fill in beforehand to make sure that I know kind of exactly what I want to talk through on that session. And then whenever we put kind of a project or something I want to work through that's kind of more strategic, it's not my kind of day-to-day work, we put time-bound elements in there, even if they're not strictly necessary. Knowing I got that deadline helps me really work to it. So that wasn't something that was kind of typically done, but we found it's what really worked for me. And I think that's where having inclusive practices really comes into play, is you were saying, Mike, not going, great, we're going to put these standards in place and everyone will conform to them because we think that's what's going to help neurodiverse individuals. But speaking to each person to figure out what is it that you're finding challenging, what is it where your strengths are, and then how can we flex within the work that we currently do to make that work for you. And I think the earlier on the organisations can start doing that, the better. So when you're doing interviews, making sure that you kind of ask people, like, how can we make this interview process better for you? Like, I know one thing that I've struggled with is when you turn up to the interview and you're not quite sure what type of interview it is, like what questions are they going to ask you? Is this about my skills or is this about what I'm like as a person? Am I interviewing with the hiring manager or the people who currently do the role? Having all of those what ifs can be really difficult for me. Version of myself. So having those expectations set up front can be really helpful. Some people like having the questions sent across to them up front. That can be really helpful. And I think unless there is a good logical argument for why some of those adjustments would contravene someone's ability to demonstrate how well they would perform in that role, making those sort of adjustments just means that we get to see the best of people. And obviously when we're working with our colleagues, we want them to bring their best version. So I think anything that we can do to help that, tailored to those individuals, it is always going to be really effective.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And one of the questions I get quite often is, okay, but particularly in these interviews, if I make it past the interview process and we're looking at the onboarding, my manager will often ask, okay, what is it you need? How is it we can support you? Now, there is this thing in the English space orders of marginalised groups to educate people, and in the day and age now of ChatGPT and things, I think one of the things we can do is be a little more proactive in going, okay, I have someone with this condition coming up, give me 5 tips to engage with them in this meeting. These are all ways you can be a little bit more proactive in discovering more. But also, I think we see time and time again on a sign up form or any of those kind of forms on, okay, do you have an accessibility need? Now, I appreciate I've done that on the registration for this webinar, but actually if you move a little bit away from the notion, I'm not saying don't ask them if you have an accessibility need, but actually reframe it as an accessibility need. These are the things we could employer. So it could be, as a employer, we can send you the questions in advance for your interview. Would that be helpful? Or we can, most of our videos have synchronized closed captions in these different languages. Would you like to turn them on? By educating people on what you have, maybe having that as a section on your website. So if you have these inclusive policies on how somebody could ask for additional help, if anyone wants to flag that they have a disability need, all of these things could make a difference. Now, I appreciate there are, in the present day, we have things like GDPR, which might stop you from collecting data on individuals. But imagine being a neurodivergent individual or an individual with any disability, really, and going to a training session, going out for lunch, or any of these things, having to declare the need each and every time on the day, which is actually putting your staff potentially under any pressure on, oh, what do I do? I've not been trained on this, versus just collecting that data. If someone declares they have an accessible need, if there is some way of logging that either on their profile, letting the trainer know in advance if indeed the individual has them, declared these things, I think anything we can do to avoid shining a spotlight on the individual in that moment of need is also going to help, because certainly in my experiences, and my experiences don't speak for everyone, but that's, if a spotlight is kind of shone on my differences, that can almost be self-fulfilling, such triggering in a way. Certainly with my tics, if I tick and it catches me off guard, and I know people are looking at me, all eyes are on me. It can be a very self-fulfilling tick more, because things that kind of trigger me is anything that would trigger agitation. That might be cold, that might be stress, that might be anxiety. And I think with that, unless you have anything to add, Lucinda, we're potentially looking at, okay, we've covered some of the barriers, and if you do have barriers, please do pop them in the chat or add them as a sticky. But we can think about, okay, what barriers are there in the workplace, and but in terms of these inclusive practices, what can we do to be proactive as opposed to always reactive in the support?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add, and I think particularly reflecting on, like, there's been some great stuff in the chat about how people have kind of managed teams or been members of team with neurodiverse individuals and the benefits that they found from that. I think one thing to always point out as well is that some people will be neurodiverse and they won't know it themselves. As I mentioned myself, I think it took me about a year to get my diagnosis for ADHD, and that was very, very, very fast. I got find a way around it. For some people, it can take years. I know some people who have been told they've got about a 4-year wait list. Other people, neurodiversity comes out in all of us differently. There are some groups who are underrepresented. ADHD in women is a great example of the fact that the stereotypical kind of features that people talk about with ADHD typically more common in young boys than they are young women. So a lot of people don't know that they're neurodiverse. And also a lot of people still don't want to talk about it. And that's completely fair. It's obviously awful that we live in a world where people have to think that way. But I even noticed in the chat a couple of people saying that, you know, they've had situations where they have had barriers there. So I think it's the reason I love the menu thing that Mike was talking about is I think we need to take the onus off of individuals to kind of prove that they have these needs or make them feel like they have to speak up about it. If we can put proactive practices in place so that it's just an environment from off, it takes the onus off of those individuals. It makes them feel less kind of like separated from other people. And one of the kind of sayings that I use a lot is the fact that accessible design is just good design. Any of the practices that you can put in place to support neurodiverse or people with any accessible needs, there's not really any situation where that's going to be detrimental to other people. So, you know, who wouldn't, you know, benefit from having the questions before an interview? It just means you can prepare more. Who wouldn't benefit from having expectations set before going into a meeting? It means that they can come with the right knowledge beforehand. Who wouldn't benefit from having the opportunity to wear noise cancelling headphones in the office to stop distractions when they're trying to focus on something? I think the biggest shift that I would want to see in workplaces is to stop it being so focused on diagnoses and more just looking at people's behaviours and the functions behind those behaviours and how we can best support those.
Yeah, it's a good point, especially in this day and age where the diagnoses, getting the diagnosis can take a long time. So that I do find within the kind of neurodivergent community there is a bit of a pushback or a bit of anger between people self-diagnosing in general society, specifically from like my grandparents, for example. You know, phrases thrown around like, "Oh, everyone's neurodiverse these days," or you know, like almost as if that's to the detriment. And ultimately, a diagnosis shouldn't matter. You know, if we all learn in different ways. Some of us will prefer to read, some of us will prefer to play, and as Lucinda has rightly mentioned, you know, by having these different options for people to consume content, to be able to engage with work, is going to make a massive difference. And if you are unsure where to start, you know, I mentioned earlier we are offering a this can help you pinpoint the urgent areas of improvement, and if you are interested, you can scan the QR code that is to the left of the klaxon, or you can pop audit in the chat. Now at this stage I appreciate we are about halfway through today's session, and there are a couple of different topics we could cover now. So there's learning and development and neurodiversity, and I appreciate not everyone on today's session is from the ND background. But still, the applications of how can we train teams and all those things are still very applicable. There's the the role of technology, so what tools and platforms can improve accessibility. There's leadership and culture, challenging misconceptions, and also amplifying neurodivergent voices. Now, if I take a moment just to check the questions from the audience, if I may.
That it feels relevant. The conversation we were just having was around if we feel that being formally diagnosed is the best way forward, and if self-diagnosis is given enough credibility. And from my perspective, I personally found getting a diagnosis almost like a bit of a relief, because for me it almost made me go like, yes, now all the puzzle pieces of why my life has been a certain way kind of fit together. It kind of gave me that reassurance. So for me it was very helpful. But even for the year before that, while I was kind of exploring the diagnoses, just learning around what my condition or potential condition at that point, I suppose, could mean, looking at what adjustments could potentially help if I had, if I had ADHD or if it was a different type of condition, was really helpful. So I think having just the awareness of yourself of where you have challenges, where you particularly thrive and can kind of bring your best self, that in itself is so massively beneficial to just have those moments of reflection to figure out what you need and what can kind of get the best out of you. But I think having the diagnoses for some people is very kind of reassuring. It kind of helps them kind of figure out who they are on that sense. So I personally don't think everyone needs it. I have friends and colleagues who have decided not to pursue that route for their own personal reasons, and they've still been able to kind of use lots of different tools available to help themselves. But if you are somebody as well that wants to look at things like medication or targeted therapy responses, sometimes having the diagnoses can help you kind of with different aspects of that and having those things signposted. So I think it just really comes down to personal preference.
Yeah, I would echo the personal preference strongly. I think when I was speaking to my therapist about this, because he was one of the ones who got me started on this journey of like, Mike, you definitely have he confirmed a lot of things that were suspected, which then led to me seeking further support. But I think one of the points he made is it's up to you whether you pursue this, because ultimately, if you get it, you simply know that you have it, and essentially you have a label. It doesn't change anything about you. It doesn't change the way you've lived up to now, or anything after. And one of the things you still can do is you can look up the resources. What help is out there for someone with this condition? If you think that would benefit from the additional support that's out there, great, you might want to apply. But it could be just knowing what the traits of someone with autism, someone with dyslexia, someone with ADHD, knowing the traits and also knowing common practices that could help you in the workplace. These are things that can only help you. And talking of tools and stuff, one of the things I was advised by my father-in-law, who is a business coach, who does work with people with neurodivergent individuals such as myself, is having a series of calendars. So in front of me on my desk, I have my weekly planner. To my left, I have my monthly planner. So breaking down tasks, what I need to do within the next few days, to look at what I need to do ahead. And I also have my daily planner and the to-do list. And just by having, one of the things that certainly helped me with is what I need to do long term, what I need to do short term, and being able to kind of prioritize that and assign value. But importantly for me, making sure that I don't miss things. And that's a big one, because quite often I can start something, but I might go off on a tangent, get down over a rabbit hole, and one of the things we did on the daily that I carried forward from my previous role in employment was the daily scrums. So I would meet with my wife in the morning and go, these are the things we are looking to do, that I'm looking to achieve today. We would check in at lunchtime then and go, okay, Mike, you said you were going to do this, and this today by lunchtime. Have you actually achieved that? And the answer is no. I know I need to kind of get back on task, back on focus, and prioritise what I've set out to do. If indeed changing is the right course of tactic, and that's what I was working on was particularly helpful. So just these things could be a person, they could be a colleague. Just if you have a supportive manager or a peer even, just to say, let's have a check-in. Let's check in at lunchtime or after lunch to see how your day's going. If you're stuck on task, I think it's a tool. There you could use the Pomodoro technique, for example, to do calendar chunking. All these things could be helpful so long as you as long as you check for it. Listen, is there any other questions at the moment that spring to mind, or shall I navigate us back towards the kind of the main topics and see how we go from there?
Yeah, should we have a look through some of these? I think just looking at some of the things in the chat, it might be helpful to zoom into some of these a bit more, because I think the volume of things on screen is a bit overwhelming for some people.
Absolutely fine. So in terms of what we'd like to discuss, hopefully you can access the board, by the way. I'm going to pop the Klaxoon link once more. So we've spoken about the impact of the neurodivergent conditions. I think this one could be interesting. So how can businesses create a neuro-inclusive work environment, kind of beyond the surface level policies? Now, we did touch on some of this earlier, but I do think leadership makes a big impact. For me, I personally see accessibility as part of D&I. Now, I know some people constantly try and separate it. I don't think it's all of D&I, though, just to be clear. So, for example, you could meet all of the web content accessibility guidelines and cater for people with disabilities, and still have potentially sexist terminology or gendered language on your website. So you could still be accessible and fail on the inclusion front. So I think there is an aspect to being aware. You could do everything from the accessibility and still be excluding people. And I think Lucinda touched on intersectionality earlier. Just simply, if you look at a lot of the statistics and a lot of the reports that are out there, they might look at, okay, what percentage of our workforce have a disability, and things like that. And there's a lot of these programs helping women in leadership or helping minority ethnicities into certain roles. I think where a lot of research has perhaps lacked a little bit and has contributed to kind of some of these other challenges is, what if you have more than one condition? So what if, for example, you are a young black neurodivergent woman, or you are a white male, yes, but from a less affluent background who might not have access to the same resources. All of these things are making a difference. I think it's important not to generalise. And one of the questions I did see earlier is, do some of the support in one area cause a detriment actually to another? And simply the answer is yes, unfortunately. So I appreciate that makes our challenge as designers all the more difficult. And I'll give you an example. Dyslexia, if you are a non-native English speaker or anything along those lines, having closed captions on by default in a video might actually be a detriment to your experience. So one of the things I always advocate in design is to expose as many of the variables as you can as possible, and come back to that menu thing. Allow people to select what they do want, kind of opt out of what they don't. So also playing video can be another one. Some people might benefit from, I struggle to find the video on the screen, to navigate to the video. Other people, if you have a automatically playing video on the website and you can't find where it is on the website, that's going to be annoying. Just having that kind of background audio, if it's in a different tab or whatever, all of these things are things that you could, if you have the kind of remember people's preferences. So I have a preference for automatically playing video on. I have a preference for captions to be on or off and in this language. By storing these variables, we can personalize the experience. And as I've kind of noted before, I can see Lucinda nodding. You know, it's not all about me today. If you want to connect with Accessible Me, you absolutely can anytime. And what I want to do is just hear from the guests. We don't have the luxury of having Lucinda on every single one of these. So yeah, I'm going to pass over to you and again hear what you think on the matter.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, whenever we're talking about supporting neurodiverse individuals in the workplace, what we're really talking about is how we empower them. It's not just about kind of giving them tools and walking away. It's about making sure we give them tools that are really going to help them. And for me, that mostly just comes down to kind of the optionality, as you were talking about there. So not kind of assuming that, you know, way is what's going to work for everyone, but going, look, here's the options. Let's figure out what's going to work best for you. And I think that there are some practices that do typically help, like sending an agenda out before meetings, making sure people are aware of what the expectations from, you know, different individuals is in those meetings. But then when it's around like how people work, some people will thrive in the busy part of the office where they've constantly got things going on so that they can kind of, you know, stay massively stimulated. I know if I'm just sitting by myself just working, that's where my brain will drift off. Whereas if I've got, you know, music on, potentially a TV show on as well, I've got a meeting coming up, having all those things going on actually helps me focus. Whereas for other people, that would be an absolute nightmare. So it's kind of having the option of what's going to work best for me and what's going to work best for everyone in the office. And I think when it comes down to it, that's where the biggest shift needs to be made. Is it's not having policies that say you have to do things a certain way. It's having a range of different things that people can tailor to best suit their needs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Is we live now in an age of personalization. People can kind of go into an experience. You can go on apps and go, okay, what would my room look like in these colours? We have a lot more variety in kind of everything from toys. We've got choices on Netflix, Amazon Prime. All of these algorithms are learning about us, and there's no reason why workplaces and learning shouldn't follow those suits. So just as an example of one of those we have on the screen at the moment, animation's a huge trend in web design right now. Some people say it can help call attention to important information, but is it more of a distraction? Now, it kind of depends, I suppose, on the focus or the intent. Now, whether you have a graphic on design, a video on a website, is to grab the focus, then great. So for example, the checkout button or add to basket, you might have a subtle thing where that has a pulse, but however, I think having anything where that might have flashing, for example, is going to cause issues with people with photosensitive epilepsy. So again, for me, it comes back to the features. I think animation can be a good thing, but animated explainers, again, if that's a video, allow people the option to, and if you do have it on by default, give people just a pause button on the screen, a way of turning that animation off. I think the more we can put in control of the end user, the better, really.
Yeah, and I think so I do a lot of work with different organisations, and one classroom-based settings, but they're trying to understand how to support neurodiverse individuals more. And one of the examples we were talking about was for people who fidget. Fidget spinners were originally invented for people, I think they were thinking people with ADHD, to give them something to fiddle with in the classroom. Obviously, that turned into a whole different thing where it became a kind of trendy toy. But one of the issues that somebody raised was they had autism, and they would actually find that really distracting, having someone with a big fidget spinner next to them, because they'd see it in the corner of their eye. And I think it's a great example of how what could help one person could then cause struggles for someone else in the room. And I think what's really important to do in those types of situations is always just try and look at it focusing on the function of the behaviour. And also just thinking around like, what could we logically do here? Don't just go, well, we're going to do one or the other. And one of the options we talked about was having fidget rings instead, which I got of, where it's something that you can sit and fiddle with kind of quietly under the table. It's not going to distract anyone else, but it will give you what you need to kind of get through. And I think that's what needs to be done in any of those situations where you think that the accommodation somebody is asking for maybe doesn't work in that working environment. Maybe it could cause challenges for somebody else, because obviously inclusivity is about trying to make sure it's a situation that benefits everyone. I think it's always just looking at, okay, what do we need to achieve to help this person? And then just thinking through all the different ways you could do that, and not kind of just reverting to hearing one idea and just blanket terming no, hearing that idea and then figuring out together, well, what could be possible to make this as beneficial as possible for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think working with individuals to see what's possible is a great way to do it. You know, if you're not sure, do ask the question. As I say, we live in an age of technology. If you Google something, you know, you're going to find answers. There's a lot of AI tools, but ultimately none of this is an alternative, or, you know, a replacement of just having those conversations. And just as you would potentially, if you're a manager, asking your colleagues, okay, how would I get the best of you? Do you know, if I want a meeting with you, or I need to catch up, do you prefer me to say, can I have 5 minutes with you? Do you prefer me to send an agenda in advance? Do you know, people have different preferences, whether they are neurodivergent or not. You know, so I do think there's a number of things here. Conscious of time and that we have a quarter of an hour to go. I certainly don't have a hard stop, so if you do have questions that don't get answered, do stay on today if you have the luxury of time to be able to do that. But let's kind of get a show of hands, I suppose. Do you know who would kind of like to explore the role of technology, leadership and culture? Actually, let's rather than a show of hands, if you could pop it into the chat. Whether you want to look at the role of tech, the role of leadership, or something else, we can absolutely do that. I'm keen to answer more of the questions. So do you want me to navigate back to the left? I can absolutely do that. Questions in the chat further up. Okay, that's fine. I can certainly call upon those. So do bear with me. Is there a specific question you have in mind, Jamie?
Yeah, apologies. I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat, and I know that Mike, you have as well, just trying to catch where all the questions are.
I can absolutely continue as well. So I'm seeing what went from Jamie on forgive me if I've phrased that incorrectly. What I would say is it's not a term I'm massively familiar with. Lucinda, is it something you are aware of, or less so?
My understanding of it is where it's around the idea that people have their attention pulled more strongly towards a smaller number of interests at any given time, which is why that they then have fewer resources almost to think about other elements. Just to double check, Jamie, is that Jamie and Leon, is that what you were meaning by monotropism? And when you say our thoughts around it, is there any area in particular you'd like us to expand on?
Give you a few moments to respond in chat, or if indeed you want to come off mute, if you feel comfortable in doing that, do feel free to do that as well. So we are happy to take your questions. We can use the raise hand system. So what I might do for just the next 10 minutes, or so, I suppose, is stop sharing the screen and kind of invite a more kind of relaxed approach. So feel free to still use the collapsing board, and if you want to answer your questions. And but yeah, Jamie, are you there?
I am unmuted. Hello. I'm trying to find the raise hand button and I can't find it.
No
so monotropism is exactly that. It's the idea that if you kind of ignore the medical definition of ADHD and autism for a minute, it's the idea that there's a a group of people who have a focus style where there's a handful of things we can focus on at any one time. And it's better for us to kind of get into long flowy attention tunnels rather than try and split our focus many ways. And for me, it's been an absolute game changer. And it's actually led to me to pretty much reject the concept of ADHD as it's the powerful medical majority trying to describe what it looks like from the outside. And monotropism is the explanation of my experience from the inside. I sometimes say it's the difference between being told I'm homosexual versus being gay, if that makes any sense. As I've been listening to you talk, I think it is such a game changer of a model that, that's why I was wondering if you'd come across it, because we basically, I run a little company doing transaction monitoring software. We detect different types of fraud. The entire company is built around monotropism and flow states. But that also means that we don't have tasks and to-do lists. We don't have fixed, the entire way of thinking about work has to be rethought because there's no real distinction between work and play. So it's very different. It's incredibly powerful and effective.
Yeah.
But it's also just utterly different to the way that, anything else works. So that's part of what I was going to ask you about it.
And kind of, in your experience, does the majority of people kind of work well with this, or has it created barriers and challenges in your own way? Because obviously we are all professionals, and whether it's your own experiences or experiences you've witnessed with your colleagues, has it created other barriers, and how have you taken that on board?
So I would say that, the research suggests that somewhere between 75% and 90% of people who would get an autism or an ADHD diagnosis, very carefully phrasing that because the diagnosis isn't necessarily a good indicator of anything, would also be monotropic. And the thing about monotropism is once you understand that the skill of the day is not starting or stopping a specific task, it's getting into or out of a flow state, you start working out all of these things. So great examples of things within our business that we never would have thought of but have been really useful is we don't schedule meetings for a specific time. We'll say, okay, we're going to catch up tomorrow morning. And then a few minutes before the chat, we'll send a Zoom link. That is totally different to how most places do it. It sounds chaotic, but it's brilliant. You're not sat there going, I've got 15 minutes before this bloody call starts. What can I do? And rather than trying to force, we try and wherever we can, we try to avoid the situation where we're trying to make somebody do a specific thing at a specific time. So the way we structure all of our work, structure our deadlines, etc., is all around this idea of giving people time to get into flow. Another thing that is very useful is when you're in these really good flow states, and I wonder if you've both experienced this, you might do something for 3 or 4 hours, get to the end of it, you come out of the tunnel and someone goes, what did you do? And you'll be like, lots of things. You can't remember the specifics, right? Because when you're in the tunnel and you're in a flow state, the rest of the world disappears. But equally, when you're outside of a tunnel and outside of the flow state has disappeared. So we set up everything we do to create artifacts that sort of things. The way that we track activity and what we are doing is we drop little breadcrumbs so that when we get asked, when we get to the what did I do today, we can go and look at the technology and it'll tell us what we've done. Because otherwise you get to the end of the day and someone goes, what did you do? And you feel crap because you're like, I did stuff. So that's another one that's kind of been really useful. There's so many things around the monotropism and the forgetting the ADHD model of I'm going to be organised and coming instead with I'm going to learn how to surf the chaos that comes my way as effectively as possible. Does that make any sense? Like we don't have a plan.
It does make sense, yeah.
We just surf it as well as we can.
And I think it really resonates with me because I'm very much one of those people where if you tell me, for example, that I need to work 9 to 5 every day, that's almost a bit of a nightmare because there'll be some days where, as you say, my brain almost struggles to get into that flow state and feeling checklist of all the things that you manage to do. And other days I'll be so ingrained in what I'm doing I'll start work early and I'll finish at God
Yeah.
knows what time because I've been so focused on it, and then I'll just take time back
Yeah.
the next day. And I think my organisation, we don't have it quite to the extent that it sounds like you guys do. We've not kind of built ourselves up around the concept of monotropism, but I think the way that we have flexibility to work definitely aids in that. And I know that I'm someone who's benefited from it, even though until you kind of explained it there, I almost didn't match the two together in my head.
Yeah.
And I think, as you say, it's an interesting way of looking at how the way we work in the workplace can shift. And I think that as kind of, you know, recent years and looking into the future, I think there is a huge, more widespread look happening at how we kind of perform at work and how we kind of plan our work days. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
One of the things that we did as a company, so I worked at the BBC for 11 years doing digital accessibility. I used to look after digital accessibility, used to run the team. And I was an R&D engineer for years before that. And I tell you what, R&D engineers just go and have playtime. Ooh, something useful happened. That's nice. So when I kind of left the BBC and started doing this, one of the things that I did is I bill for my time in spoons, not hours, because time is not particularly useful to me. Yeah. I can burn, so spoons are my unit of energy for the day. Let's say I've got 10 spoons a day, right? I can burn through all 10 spoons in 2 hours, or I can use 5 spoons to do 6 or 7 hours of something really flowy, like coding or something. So when I said, actually, in the format of a week, it's not my time that is the limited supply, it's the energy that's the limited supply. Yeah. So I will charge my clients based on energy. And I worked with people like, you know, Lego and B&Q and these massive companies. You'd think they'd go, no, we need a day rate, you need to bill us in hours. No, they're totally happy for me to build them in spoons. And sometimes it's to if I'm doing a presentation or delivering training and it's being recorded, it's way, way more spoons if it's being recorded. I'm sure you might experience this feeling like, yeah, if it's creating a permanent record, I need to think about it a bit more. So yeah, if somebody said, oh, we'd like to record this talk, I'll be, okay, that'll be a 5 or 6 spoon event then. Yeah. But the actual talk itself is only 2 spoons. So if you only need to record it because you need to show it to people in Europe and then to people in America, it's actually cheaper for me to do the talk twice.
Yeah.
Because it's 4 spoons.
Perfect.
So being able to have this conversation around how the energy is being used, it's distinct from time, is really good. And I know that I've got between 5 and 10 spoons worth of doing stuff each day. So there's a question in there, which is how do you describe billing that way when they want project pricing? I go and estimate the project in spoons, basically. Yeah. So for example, if it's the difference between complexity and time, right? So if I already know how to do it, so I'm doing some accessibility testing. I know how to do that. I know typically how many spoons it's going to be, and I know roughly how much I can get through for that energy, right? So I can then estimate it against the spoons. If it's something that I'm not sure how to do, well, the spoon cost is higher because I'm going to have to work it out, and that is part of what I'm being paid to do, right? Yeah. So the uncertainty of what I know becomes part of the project pricing, which makes the project pricing more accurate. But it also means sometimes having to say to a client, actually, I'm probably not efficient to do that piece of work because I don't know that CMS or I don't know that system. Probably worth finding someone else for that. It's sort of like sometimes I have to choose not to try and learn another 10 systems because it's too easy to go, I'll go learn that, I'll go learn that. Other times you need to learn to go like, I've already learned 5 new things this month. I think I'm going to just focus on doing the things I know how to do. And then finding that balance of things that are new, exciting, discovery, adventure versus things that are refining that I've already got is kind of part of the joy, and then kind of do that. So I did a project for Lego recently, and I used AI to generate an application to help me write the alt text. So I had to do alt text for 100 and something images. I am way too ADHD to look at a photo, then go to the config file, write a description in the config file, click save, upload it to the right bar. Not a chance. So I used an AI tool called Gwencoder to generate a UI. So it's a dedicated little app, and all it does is show me the picture and give me a box to write the alt text in. When I click next, it saves it in the format their CMS needed. That took me less than an hour. Right?
Sounds fantastic, Jamie. And I think as as a tool, I think it's definitely something for us to read up on. It maybe even be a cause for a future webinar, in its own right. So yeah, definitely drop your details after the meeting that we can follow up and maybe have like a share log which can go either the accessibility page on LinkedIn or from your own, which we can share. But I think based on the audience and the chat, it sounds fantastic. So definitely all of these tools are things that are super important. I do appreciate we are at time. I did say I'm happy to go on, but for those that do have to disappear, for anyone that does want to dive deeper, you can, as I say, book your free accessibility audit with us. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the key resources, the session highlights, and an opportunity for you to book a short call if you want to do that. So let's grab a time, maybe 20 minutes or so next week, just to continue this conversation and hear from everyone. Thank you very much for everyone who has joined today's session, and a massive thank you for Lucinda for making yourself available. So if you do have to drop off, everyone, thank you very much for joining. And as I noted,
And of course, if there is anyone that has questions that they don't want to kind of air in the public space as well, Mike and I are both on LinkedIn, and now I'm speaking for you, Mike, but I'm sure neither of us would mind if there are any questions that you want to send across directly as well.
Absolutely. One of the things I did following last month's webinar was I took the questions that went in and didn't unfortunately have time to answer in the chat, and we blogged on that. So there are a number of ways. If you haven't had the opportunity to be heard today, either you can book a meeting with us, you can get in touch on LinkedIn, and if you still have the Claxon board open, on the left hand side you will find a QR code and clickable hyperlinks to take you directly to either one of us. So thank you so much for, as I say, for joining. If anyone does have questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature if indeed you know how to do that. If you don't, just pop in the chat, I have a question, and we can come to you next. But yeah, thank you for everyone. I can see many of you dropping off. If you have a question, feel free to go ahead and answer. Go ahead and ask.
I think one thing that might it'd be great for us to send in that send out piece that I don't think we touched on that much was around how to handle pushback. If they're in an organisation you ask for accommodations and there's kind of pushback, and my response to that is always just going very much around the logic side of just asking them to kind of explain why they don't think it's possible in that. But yeah, it might be something that's worth us just putting a little bit on, because I think there are a couple of questions around that topic.
Yeah, I think pushback is a big one. Certainly I see pushback come up time and time again in terms of how do I deal with some of the requests, and how do I know some of these requests are authentic. But ultimately, I think what really okay, if you are asking someone to do something, either in a time fashion way or in a specific way, what's the logic behind doing that? So, for example, if they are asking for extra time in for their assignment, and you can give them 10% extra time, 20% extra time, what would be the detriment to making that a feature which people can request? Is the job you're asking them to do actually time bound? If they are applying for like a bomb technician job where they have to defuse the wire quickly, or an operation, those things matter. If you so the time flow matters. But if you are, say, for example, serving drinks or making photocopies of something, these things don't necessarily. So I think trying to understand I think understanding people's mindsets works two ways. So you can understand the backing or pushing back, and they should do their bit to understand you as well. And I think that's where the compromises come in. So if you can understand, okay, why is it they're pushing back? Is it directed? Is it mandated that, you know, I can't cover these things? Or actually, is it your personal bias? Is there some flexibility? I think trying to trigger that conversation is going to be much more effective than trying to do a coup. You know, like, oh, I've not been understood. You know, let's cause some problems. And I think, yeah, people often push back because they're scared, certainly of relinquishing control. And I think the whole push to get people back into the physical brick and mortar workplace is an example of this. You know, for a number of neurodivergent individuals, work from home has been fantastic. Certainly for myself, you know, if I'm in meetings and I can have my tools like Otter AI, take the transcript, it allows me to give the other people my full attention. But that there is a balance, you know. So if we are in a group meeting and someone's late and we are waiting for that individual, if I don't get what I need, you know, my action items or whatever covered in the first 5 or 10 minutes, I can disengage, you know, and it's very, very difficult to pull me back into the meeting. Listen, I don't know if that resonates with you, but do you have any immediate thoughts on dealing with pushback?
I think it's exactly what you said. I think it's about understanding where their pushback is coming from. And I have luckily never been in this situation, but I know someone who essentially just got told because that's the way they've always done it. And I think very much like Jamie and Leon have kind of put in the chat, sometimes people push back because they are scared, because, you know, change is something that the majority of people do find a little bit scary, even when it's also exciting. And I think it's just having those frank conversations to kind of, you know, okay, well, what's stopping us from changing it now? So just getting them to kind of help you go through it logically. And just making sure they understand where you're coming from, explaining
Yes.
that, you know, I'll be able to perform better, do better for our team, you know, make us all look better if you let me kind of work in this way that's going to be a lot more beneficial for me. And as you say, understanding what the limitations are and doing what you can to work around them, and just not being afraid to go a little bit against the status quo. I can see Karina has come off mute. Karina, I don't know if you had a question or a comment around that part of conversation. Or if it was just a wrong button press, that's also valid.
Might have been a wrong button press. It sounded like a wrong button press at the moment. But,
were you talking to me? I was just going to get my child.
Oh, no worries. One question that's come up in the chat.
I think there may be specific. I don't know if there's like a UK-wide equivalent to something like Monster or Indeed, but a week or no, about maybe like 2 weeks or so now, I spoke at the Berkshire Skills Hub event, you know, which was an event hosted. It's an inclusive hiring program, and there are certainly, now I'm working with Coventry City Council. There are a number of like local job postings, and so I think it's supported by a number of larger organisations like the Department of Work and Pensions, and, you know, and things like that. There are a number of local schemes which can help people with mentoring and opportunities. And one of the things that I found really insightful on that day is to help create these opportunities to get people into the workplace. So one example was apprenticeships. So by giving people apprenticeships, you can have opportunities to contribute to the workplace, and very often you'll find they bring a lot of skills to the table which you might not have necessarily. So, for example, someone with autism or whatever may, for example, go, whilst they're being explained the processes, go, oh, that's rubbish. Why are you doing it that way? It'd be so much easier to do it this way. Now, it might be delivered in a way where you might go, oh, that's a bit harsh, you know, but actually the under message, you know, if they've identified a better way of doing something, is an opportunity to grow. And I think by, again, just the more diverse we make our workforce, the better it is going to be for everyone. So take product testing, for example. There are soap dispensers which, if people with black skin, their hand under it won't release the soap because they weren't there in the focus groups when these products were being released. Now, when we are designing products, whether that's phones, whether that's food, whether that's our products or services, if we don't have people with disabilities in our workforce, whether that's neurodiverse individuals, whether that's otherwise, there's a good chance that they're going to be missed in part of their design, especially if they're not consulted in the design phase before you've gone to production or you've gone to the deployment. And there are a lot of statistics to say if you wait to go from the design stage to the production stage, actually it's at least 10% more expensive to try and add these accessibility fixes. If you wait to the deployment and release, actually it can be as much as 60 times more expensive than if you'd just thought about it from the start. So I think these are all really important things. Okay, just have these conversations, involve us in the work group, and trying to remember the kind of the phrase "nothing for us without us." So is a big phrase within the disabled community where people will say, "Okay, just make sure we're part of that conversation. Don't design on our behalf. Ask us. Have those conversations." I think I've gone on a complete tangent and not answered the original question, but I think just goes to show my neurodivergent brain. Lucinda, you're laughing and you've got a mute.
It's a good tangent to go on, and my favourite visual to explain ADHD will always be where it's like a mind map, where it's just like normal people, neurotypical people, the point they're trying to make, getting to the point, people with ADHD, the point they're trying to make, and then it's like a big squiggly line getting to it.
Basically, yes.
But I think the point you were saying there of design accessibility, accessibly and inclusively from the start, it's always the way to go. So I work with a huge, range of different organizations. Games, Rise modules, Storyline modules, the whole shebang. And one of the things that we sometimes see is we'll design something and then a couple of months into the project or towards the end of the project or after it's been delivered, they'll suddenly go, oh, actually, we need to meet the WCAG accessibility guidelines, or, we've had a new policy come in, so we want to, or we've changed our minds, so now we want to. And then trying to retrofit that in is a lot more expensive and a lot more challenging than if you do it from the start, especially because the way you design, it can be really affected by those things. What seems like a small thing of, oh, well, we'll just make it screen reader accessible. Well, if you haven't thought that way from the start, because that wasn't put across as the priority, then it can really change the way that you have to amend the build and everything. So I think getting to a point where being accessible and inclusive right from the off is the way to go forward. It's actually going to save businesses a lot of time. That should always be a first consideration. And that is one of the first questions we now ask with any organisations we work with, is around things like what their accessibility needs are, what their internal policies towards that are, and also the questions around, well, if we don't design it accessibly, what could that mean for people in your business? Are we going to be making some content inaccessible to them? So I think always a question to ask right up front in anything we're doing regarding learning or just workplace environments.
I think a lot of some of the pushback I get on WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is quite often those of us with neurodivergent needs are overlooked. And one of the things the W3C behind the WCAG guidelines are doing is, I think it's something like CCAG or something along those lines, but there is a neurodivergency specific set of criteria. There's 9 of which need to be considered, and again, a lot of those you might work through them going, this is just common sense, but there's a good chance, it might be common sense, but are you doing it? And I think that's a thing that a lot of workplaces need to consider. Yes, we might be aware we need to do X, Y, and Z, but are you doing that in practice? Because I think doing something and saying something and doing something are two very different things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of with WCAG, I think in their more recent updates there has been more of a focus on neurodiversity, and I think a lot of things that benefited people with neurodiversity, I think, have quite often always been there, and it's almost more just shining the spotlight now as well on how that does actually link into the neurodiversity side of things. So I think that's one thing I've definitely noticed, is it's almost like the connection in my head of, oh, that's why it helps me, because it just didn't connect to kind of my understanding of myself before that.
Yeah. And so I can see some people leaving now. So thank you, Donna, for joining us. There are about 13 participants, including the two of us, still on the call. It could be that they have disappeared and aren't here, or it could be that you're still here and you still have a question. So if you are still here and you do still have a question, please do feel free to either pop your question in the chat or come off mute, and if it's something you want to discuss, you absolutely can. But once again, I'd like to thank Lucinda for joining me today, and all of you for joining the session. The recording will be made available for those that want to access it.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
I can hear a voice, but I can't see. So is it Jamie again?
It's Jamie again. I got two
Okay, cool,
thoughts for you. So the first one, with more cognitive accessibility within that's the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force and the Cognitive Accessibility Working Group. We're looking for new members. Come join us.
Very happy to.
I technically co-chair it, though if I'm honest, I haven't actually been that involved much in the last 6 months or so. Moving house, getting ill, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, there is more and more cognitive accessibility coming into WCAG. The trouble is, a lot of it is hard to make because WCAG ends up being used within laws.
Yes.
It has to hit a certain level, and that makes it very difficult to put cognitive accessibility things in. Though we have a separate document called Making Content Usable. I've popped it into the chat for you. I realised that the document Making Content Usable is entirely unusable and inaccessible. It's an irony that is not lost on us, but it is worth digging through to get some good stuff. The other thing I was going to mention is, have you come across the concept of barriers-focused conversations when you've been dealing with pushback? So when you've kind of...
It's one of those things where the term is ringing a bell, and I feel like as soon as you start explaining it, I'll go, oh yeah, of course that's what it is. I can't off the top of my head.
So what you do is you flip the conversation around to make the centre of the conversation the barrier that is being experienced, not the person who is experiencing the barrier. So, for example, rather than saying, I'm autistic and the lighting is, I'm autistic and it's too bright in here.
Yes.
You'd instead go, the lighting in here, the barrier that I'm experiencing is it's too bright and I can't control the brightness. That is causing the problem. The solution should be to change the environment, to change the lighting by giving somebody control or something. These barriers-focused conversations, when I do coaching work, it's one of the biggest things I can do to help people get more out of their employer or more flexibility, is to talk about the barrier that you're experiencing in the environment, rather than saying, I have autism, therefore. Like, just ignore the medical words entirely and just talk about the barrier.
It sounds very similar to something that I know a lot of psychologists do, and is very prevalent for like neurodiversity, is stop looking at the behaviour, look at the function behind the behaviour. So, for example, if somebody is fidgeting a lot, don't focus on the fact that they're fidgeting. Focus on why are they fidgeting? Is it because they're overstimulated? Is it because they need to take a break? Look at what it is that's kind of causing things to happen, exactly as you say there. So if it's someone struggling with the bright light, what's causing that struggling is the bright light. So kind of focus on that. So I think it's it's a great way of framing things and kind of coming back to what we were saying earlier. It takes the onus off the individual as well. It kind of doesn't make it feel like they're a problem, because they're not. It's the environment that's problematic for them.
One of the challenges, so this is kind of social model of disability stuff, one of the challenges is that we live in a world that is neuronormative. E.g., there are assumptions about behaviour that are made simply because the that way. So
Yes.
fiddling or eye contact are great examples of these. In the past, I might say, oh, yes, let's have an intervention around excessive fiddling. These days, I would say, no, that's just a neuronormative assumption, sort of.
Yeah.
Like, if fiddling isn't harming anybody, cool. If they're making a clicking noise that is causing problems for other people, let's redirect, let's find another strategy. But so many of the assumptions we have within the work environment are neuronormative, it can sometimes, you sort of almost have to bounce the person who sees it as a problem to go, why is that a problem? And often the answer is because I've always believed it to be a problem, but they can't actually list a thing. So one of the things that I've sometimes done when I'm helping people with stuff, when they have pushback, is I ask them to ask the person who's pushing back for the barriers that are causing them to push back. So you have the barrier that you're experiencing. So let's go back to that lights example. We used to go into this meeting room at the BBC, massively bright light. And we pushed back and said, hey, this is not great. Very bright room, white walls, bright, why has this tiny meeting room got 7 massively bright lights in it?
Yes.
That can't be turned off. So the person I was chatting to said, yes, okay, I'll go chat to workplace. And then workplace came back with, nope, we can't do anything. If it's a legal requirement, go through legal, right? So rather than do that, I went and chat to them and go, why is this a problem? And it turned out that those lights were on the same circuit as another light. Right? So it was a fairly straightforward engineering thing. And what ended up happening was chatting to them, we chatted to the workplace people. They needed about £500 to separate the 2 circuits. So one of the teams at the BBC just paid the £500 to have it done, right?
Yeah, I imagine in terms of the difference that made, the £500 has probably saved them a fortune in terms of productivity of certain individuals.
Bingo, right? So it was very straightforward, but it had to have a conversation that didn't go legal, that didn't go, I have autism therefore. It started off as, here's a reasonable thing, and then it ended with, what are the barriers to stop you from helping? Because generally speaking, most people want to help. You get the occasional individuals who don't, and I just feed them to the lion.
And I think what's really important there as well is I think sometimes, I'm not against people using labels. I think if it helps them, that's there. But I do also think sometimes when you start bringing labels into things, it can cause people to get their backs up if they have always thought a certain way. So if, for example, somebody just said, it's a bit bright in here, can we turn the lights down? People would react one way. But if somebody else said, I have autism, for example, I find that lighting very harsh and distracting and now I'm struggling, then it's a very different sort of it becomes a big conversation rather than something people can just do. So I definitely see where you're coming from with sometimes it's better to, I think, just try the simplest route first of just going, can we change the lighting? And then not to escalate until it feels like it's needed. Because as you say, a lot of people will wonder if they just, I think, certain terminology is used because then in their head it becomes a much bigger thing than it actually needs to be.
There's also an inverse of this, which is that it's very important to understand how the Equality Act defines disability. So people will say things like autism is a disability. No, that's not how UK law works in the slightest. A disability is somebody is disabled and protected when they have a substantial impairment lasting more than 12 months. It doesn't have to be diagnosed, doesn't have to have a name. If you've got evidence that it's a substantial impairment that's lasted more than 12 months, you are protected under the disability part of the Equality Act and you have a legal right to reasonable adjustments. The number of people who have gone, I'm going to ask for reasonable adjustments once I get my diagnosis. And I'm like, no. The very fact that I was involved in an employment tribunal where the evidence of sustained impairment was the very emails from the employer telling the employee off. As, look, I've had this problem concentrating at meetings for more than a year. How do you know? We got emails getting grumpy with me for it from over a year ago. I then asked for reasonable adjustments, which were never offered. So therefore, it's a breach of law. So that thing about you have a legal right to reasonable adjustments before diagnosis, before any of that sort of stuff, as long as you can evidence that it's lasted more than a year and it has a substantial impairment. So even when you do go to the point where you're looking for reasonable adjustments and you are actually taking the more legalistic approach, make sure that you're doing it with an understanding of how disability law actually works. There are many HR departments at very large organisations who don't actually understand the legal definition of disability. So some of my work is going, no, let's not turn this. Yeah, like the amount of times I've literally been like, you're going to lose at the employment tribunal because you've got the wrong end of the stick. Let's have a 10-minute chat now because it's going to be real embarrassing when you try and explain that to a judge. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just trying to help you. That tends to work quite well. And Fortune 500 companies I've had that chat with. So yeah, so that understanding of like reasonable, so you kind of got that, present it as a barriers thing and ask for help with the barrier. If you do have to escalate to reasonable adjustments, that's not a medical thing. That is a legal disability thing. And then if you have to escalate further from there, make sure you've got a proper legal backing behind you. It's more complicated than it looks. So there you go. Sorry, I'm monologuing again, so I should shut up. I'm also waiting for a deploy to finish, so I should go and see whether that has finished. It has finished, so I should probably go do that.
So I think that's pretty much everyone else jumped.
There is one, and I can see a comment from, hopefully I pronounced the name right, is it Iona? So it says, thinking about social anxiety that often comes in kind of with neurodiversity, apart from increasing kind of neurodiversity awareness and creating clear communication, what other adjustments is it you recommend? Now, for me, there's a few things that can work from this. So my daughter at the moment, she is at the Circles Network. Circles Network are a charity who help children with autism and a number of other conditions, kind of engage through things like equestrian-based learning and stuff. Now, she got herself into a panic last night. Oh, by the way, I will flag that she, like myself, is a neurodivergent individual. She got into the panic of, well, what do I don't know people. Now, even if you're not divergent, going into a room full of people you don't know can be scary. So, one of the things you can do is, if you have a session such as a company gathering or maybe a meal, you can do things in advance. So you might have a digital get together. So one of the things I do is part of giving back is I lead and support the Learning Technologies 30 under 30. One of the things we try to do as a part of that is create in advance so that when people come to the event itself, you have at least a small community of people around you. That sense of familiarity. Oh, I've met this person. I've discussed it. I've spoken to this person. Making sure that they have that to go in advance, so that when they are in this group setting where it can be a bit sensory overload, they've got a trusted, reliable friend they can speak to. Another thing I often do as well is look at, okay, if you have your venue, your space, it could be the workplace, it could be a training environment, having a sensory space, or something away from the main buzz. Open office floor plans can be a particular challenge for individuals who are neurodiverse. So just to have somewhere we can go that's a bit more quiet, that's in itself can make a big difference. Now, Lucinda, hopefully you won't me using you as a kind of an example here, but certainly I remember the difference it made at Learning Technologies when we went away from the hustle bustle of the exhibition and everything else, just to having that quiet chat. So I think creating safe spaces, they could be digital, they could be physical, I think that goes beyond creating the awareness and the communication piece, and just go, okay, and also just being forthcoming with your own vulnerability. So one of the first things I do with my Learning Technologies cohort is go, I have these conditions. Before, when I went into this situation, I was scared. I was that individual. So you can kind of normalize it. So by demonstrating empathy as an individual, are building that kind of relationship with people where you kind of build trust, build that rapport, and I think again that can just making people feel less alone, less isolated is a big one for me. I grew up feeling very othered, and I'm very fortunate to have worked with the people I've worked with that have made me feel included. Listen, if you've got anything to add, I appreciate we're almost half hour over, so if you do need to duck, I respect that.
That's fine. I'll need to jump in about 4 minutes. But the other thing I would say is really useful to look at is understanding around things like masking. So I know one of the typical
Yes.
reasons that people really get bad anxiety with ADHD or autism or whatever it may be is because we naturally, socially are kind of pushed into masking what our natural behaviours would be to try and meet the societal norms and the norms of within our working places. And it can be really good just to learn more about that, unpack it in your head. It can help reduce some of the anxieties. So a obvious example one for me is learning, like if I'm in a meeting with other people and I'm eating an apple and I've got the apple core left over, the logical thing is just to go and stand up and put it in the bin sort of thing, or to ask if I can go out of the room to throw something away or whatever it may be. I will sit there in my head contemplating for a good 15 minutes, like, am I going to look weird if I get up and throw the apple away? Are people going to pay attention to me? What if I trip over a chair on the way there? And because of the way my ADHD works, I will overthink it in a way that's different to necessarily just typical anxiety would be. And learning the kind of how masking works of almost, I can unlock some of those behaviours, and that will help me be able to just get up and do those things. Sometimes it could be a case of almost asking my manager before the meeting of, oh, hey, we all good to have food in this meeting, and then it kind of lets me know that going and doing that wouldn't be considered an abnormal behaviour. I think understanding how our brains work differently, and understanding kind of your own thought processes, and then understanding how you've maybe started shuttering some of those down has massively kind of increased those anxieties, can actually help you then kind of start to unwind them and unpack them. And it can help you realise as well that just because your brain's kind of doing it that way, other people's won't be. And I think that's one of the key things that really clicked for me, was realising that while I'm overthinking all these things, if I then think of someone else in the meeting going and, maybe they went and dropped their apple core off and they tripped over on the way there, I don't think I've ever thought about that for more than 2 seconds, except to go, oh, were they okay? And I think that's a really big thing for me, was just understanding how other people may view my actions is never going to be as bad as how I would view my own. And that for me was a massive reassuring piece on the anxiety front.
Yeah, we can be, I think the imposter syndrome kicks in. We can be our own kind of worst advocates and stuff like that. So it's really insightful. Lucinda, I appreciate you. We've got to go, so thank you once again for joining us, and thank you for everyone who has stayed the full 1 hour and a half today. Really appreciated. Once again, if you are interested in making your workplace more inclusive, do take us up on the offer of the audit. I just want to say thank you everyone for joining. We do have some more sessions, so there is monthly sessions actually, so look on the Eventbrite and reflect on the series. If you're interested, come and see us again, and please do give us your feedback. If you've enjoyed this, let us know in the comments in the video, and do complete the survey. With that, I would say thank you so much for everyone who's joining. A massive thank you to Lucinda for joining me today, and do connect with us. We are here to help. The only silly question is one that doesn't get asked. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and I'll see you again.
Thanks very much, Jill. Bye.
Cheers. Take care.